One thing that's obvious when you study religious traditions and folklore from around the world is that our identity, both individually and collectively, is built around storytelling. That's one of the biggest pitfalls of the literalism of the churches I grew up in, because no one told us that the stories we were hearing were written less to document the facts than to show us the truth of who we are and who we want to be. It's kind of like how the reason that everyone was so disappointed in the ending of Game of Thrones was that they said that putting Bran on the throne was about giving the people a good story, but that last season was so rushed that we really didn't get the character development to give us that story. We define who we are by the stories that we tell to ourselves and others. A good example, and pretty timely one, of how this happens at a cultural level is how Americans are thought to think of Thanksgiving. For generations, schools have taught this whitewashed narrative about the Pilgrims fleeing religious persecution, coming to America, making friends with the Wampanoag people who lived in the area. And that story has been used to pretend that the history of white colonialism in this country was ever not written in the blood of Black and Indigenous people. The problem is that story we grew up with is a lie. They weren't nice people running from an oppressive government. They were kicked out of Britain and then Holland for trying to force their religious views on other people. Before the British government decided to ship them off to the New World to get them out of the way and establish a colonial presence where the Roanoke colony had failed. The story we're told about a shared feast between colonizers and indigenous people in 1621 doesn't appear to have happened either. The churches during the colonial period regularly held, quote, days of Thanksgiving when events went in their favor, but the indigenous folks generally weren't invited. In fact, one notable example of such a day was in 1637 after the colonists slaughtered between 600 and 700 people in men, women, and children in the Pequot Massacre. But like many of the stories were told to convince us of the supposed goodness of this country, the feel-good myth retold over turkey and dressing is painted on to hide the scars of colonialist brutality. It perpetuates harm for the sake of our own comfort. We see this a lot, this false narrative to sell us on a bill of goods in capitalist structures. For example, the Black Friday sales. I worked in retail for a long time, and I could tell you that you're not actually getting everything cheapest on that day. The reason they can get away with calling it the biggest sales of the season or whatever is because of the number of items that are on sale, not how far they're marked down. And those self-serving false narratives even show up in our personal interactions. During the 2020 protests, I wasn't able to be out marching for the simple reason that it's kind of hard to march when you're limited in how much you can walk. An organizer who I otherwise really respect told me, I kind of feel like that's an excuse. Lots of people are out there with their disabilities. Then this year, that same organizer was diagnosed with a serious illness. I put in the effort to find assistance for them to bring their medication costs per month down from half their rent to less than a tank of gas. So 2 days later, when they made a Facebook post praising God or karma or the ancestors or whatever for their own resourcefulness in finding the programs I sent them, that really hurt me. And even more so this week when they made another post about how they've been alone and unsupported and not taken seriously for their medical issues. I mean, it's not like I wanted praise for something that I offered to do for somebody that I care about, but telling the world unprompted that nobody had bothered to care about them, that cut pretty deep. Because human relationships are so deeply linked to the stories we tell ourselves, both individually and across groups, The only way to make authentic connections is to make sure that the stories we tell reflect who we really are and what we've really experienced and done. If we don't have answers, we have to admit it. If we've had help, and all of us have at some point, then we can't pretend we did it all alone. If we harm people, we have to acknowledge that harm and make amends. Spinning our stories to make us look better only harms us and our community in the long run.